During the course of my time in government, I had a lot of responsibility for running teams, running negotiations and working across international boundaries. So quite a lot of experience in managing people, teams, nations coming at things from really very different perspectives. And some of what I do now, in the little bit of work that I continue to do in my day-to-day life, is lecturing on things like negotiating and influencing and leadership and managing difficult conversations. So when Charlie asked if I was prepared to talk about this, I said yes, I was very happy to do so. And I should say right at the start that because I'm still new and learning about men's sheds, I hope that what I've prepared today is applicable to all of you. And I hope that you take away something that's of use. I understand the question and the request for this workshop came out of the network of sheds, feeling that things had changed in some sheds, dynamic post-lockdown and what have you. So I'm really happy to talk about that. I'm also the kind of speaker that is very happy to take questions. You know, if there's something you don't understand, if I say something you don't get, or if you want to explore something, shout out. Let's make it a dynamic session. What I will do, of course, is if we're running short of time, I will try to just move things along perhaps, and I'm around for the whole of the rest of the day if anyone does have any follow-up questions they want to ask. And Charlie's going to put my contact details on the website if anyone does want to come back to me subsequently, and we'll be making this presentation available. So it's my observation in the years that I've had of working across difference that you can put a group of people together and they can achieve a goal. And if that group is composed of people who all think absolutely alike, they can still achieve that goal. But of course, if you build a group of people together with the same common goal, and that group has a real diversity of views and opinions and backgrounds, that project really flies. And the first you get the project, but it might be quite constrained. It's not open to external challenge or views because everyone's in a groupthink mentality. So difference for me is something to value. Difference for me is something to embrace. And it's in every aspect of our lives. Understanding our differences and understanding ourselves, and we're going to do a little bit around a personality questionnaire, which I'll come on to in a bit. For me, that's the absolute cornerstone. When we talk about understanding difference, we so often think about the other person and how the other person is wrong. What they're saying just isn't right, it doesn't work. And yet, of course, an awful lot of it comes from us. And if we understand ourselves, if we really understand what's going on inside us, and if we really have a focus on what differences are out there, and have some tools to reflect on what might be going on with us, we can manage difference an awful lot better going forward. So I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start talking about us. I'm going to start talking about difference. I'm going to talk about unconscious bias, and then talk about some of the tools that we use. And in between those two things, between talking about ourselves, talking about the tools, we'll do this quick questionnaire, and we'll leave space at the end for a discussion. Difference is absolutely everywhere. You know, we all understand that difference is around us, whether it's in our personal lives, our working lives, whether it's in your shed, whether it's down the pub. It's absolutely everywhere. Difference occurs in personality, in culture, in working culture, sexual orientation, religion, political beliefs, school, education, whatever it is, there's difference around us, and we face difference everywhere we look. Sometimes that difference is really visible, and sometimes that difference is far less visible. So in terms of visible, what we all notice, stuff we all notice, can anyone give me an example of something that without fail you will notice about another person when you meet them for the same time, for the first time? Ponytail. There is absolutely something about experience, but you might not get it if you're face on to someone. Sorry.
I was just going to say some particular attributes: colour of hair, colour of skin.
Yeah.
Tall, short, fat.
They are things that we register on some ways. But actually what behavioral scientists can show, and they've shown in some really interesting experiments, is two things that we notice without fail about another human being are their skin colour and their gender. Those are the two things that first leap out at us. And they've done some very interesting experiments. There was one, for example, done in the States where they did, they filmed covertly at a hotel check-in. So you walk up to the check-in and there's somebody there who starts getting your details, and they duck under the desk to get your key card. And the person who then pops up to do the rest of your check-in is a different person. And without fail, everybody noticed when that person was a different skin colour or a different gender. And yet when they were looking at all sorts of other things, hair colour, eye colour, height, it didn't especially register with everybody. And of course there are extremes, and this is a key thing. When someone is very different to you, then we do register it. And there's some biological underpinning to that where we are programmed going way back in our evolution to spot difference, because difference might be dangerous. There are other things that we notice far less. I don't know how many of you had the experience, maybe even sort of generated by COVID, but I have a mate I went to school with. We met when we were 9 years old, and we have been best mates ever since. And I think I know everything about him better than his mum and dad, better than his ex-wife, better than anyone else in his life, and he feels the same about me. And during COVID, it turned out that my mate, Simon, is a passionate anti-vaxxer. I'm not. And wow, that was a shock to both of us. We both thought we knew each other so very well. He thought instinctively, because I have quite an interest in natural health, that I would be in the anti-vaxxer camp. And I thought, because I know he's so passionately interested in health and well-being and the safety of his children, that he would be in the vaxxer camp. And wow, how do we not spot that coming? Doesn't actually make a difference to our friendship. It's a really interesting point.
In some cases it might be.
Yes, it absolutely might. Absolutely might. I mean, look at the anecdotal evidence there is out there of people who have fallen out with each other over Brexit. There are families where people don't talk to each other because one voted for and one voted Remain. And equally passionate about their views, and for some reason they've allowed that to taint the overall relationship, which I will come back to as a really interesting point. But our life, our experience, our upbringing, our education, our parents, our friends, our culture, our basic biology, as I've alluded to, all leave us with something that's quite commonly referred to, you've probably come across it in various walks of life, as unconscious bias. And an unconscious bias is the sorts of stereotypes that we have about certain groups of people, ponytails perhaps, that we form completely outside our conscious thinking. These are subconscious things that go on. These are part of our ancient defense mechanisms. They are shortcuts to to decision making that evolved thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago somewhere in Africa, if you're an evolutionist, of course. It's the kind of response that is responsible for all those cat videos you've seen on YouTube where someone puts a cucumber behind a cat and the cat spots it and leaps in the air because its first reaction is, it's a snake. We are all hardwired to think that snakes are dangerous. That's our first unconscious bias. Some of us go on to own snakes and love snakes, but that's our fundamental, it's the thing that makes you jump when the rubber spider comes down on the piece of fishing wire from the upstairs landing. Your first reaction, ugh, even if you very quickly then recognize it's a rubber spider. That's where some of this comes in. And of course, it's really helpful in that survival context. It's really important in that survival context. But what it does do in shortcutting our decision making is make us open to bias about other people with whom we engage. There's all sorts of things out there about the different types of unconscious bias, and I'm going to skip through these. It's a very easy Google if you want to look into this a little bit more. Some people boil it down to 7, some people have 11. I've just taken this slide because it's the one I laid hands on, and it's a close version to what I use in some of my other presentations. And I think it quite neatly describes the sorts of unconscious bias we have. So the affinity bias, we tend to favour people who are kind of like us, who think like us. We gravitate towards people who are a bit like us in what they do, how they speak, what their politics might be. The appearance bias, whether or not we do have a reaction to ponytails, to beards, or at the extreme end, when we start talking about skin colour and racism. Confirmation bias. This is very much in the news at the moment, and if David Spiegelhalter had been talking about his statistics, I'm sure he would have touched on this. But this idea that we see more and more of now, that people will form an opinion and then look for the evidence that supports it. And we can all think of really egregious examples. For example, think of some of the big cases, criminal cases that have been overturned recently because it was discovered that the police at the time focused on a suspect and worked only on the evidence that supported that suspect, instead of maintaining an open mind and looking at all the evidence. It's a really key, important one, I think, particularly in this day and age, with sources of information out there that are so varied but also so unreliable in many ways. You can get your argument for anything you want by going on the internet these days. Attribution bias. This is where we explain somebody's behaviour by who they are rather than what the behaviour is. So-and-so did this because they're that sort of person. It's really negative. And that's quite often how we explain other people's behaviour. It's one of the traps we quite often get into in personal relationships. And it's one that we really have to avoid in that sort of context, because it's very easy to start forming that sort of bitter resentment about somebody's character rather than focusing on the behaviours they're delivering. Gender is self-explanatory. Age bias is self-explanatory. Authority bias is a really interesting one. People quite often take more comfort from what is being delivered to them by somebody in authority. That could be somebody in uniform. It could be accepting the statistics that the Prime Minister delivers from behind a podium that David Spiegelhalter will then rant about and say these are absolute rubbish. But there are people that will accept certain data because it comes from somebody in a position of authority without necessarily questioning it in the same way that they might. You know, they might really poke at the used car salesman who's trying to get rid of a car to them and really have a go at what they're saying. But when it comes from a police officer in uniform, oh, that's okay then. I'm not saying we should all go out there and then question the police at every junction or every time you get stopped for speeding. And then we come on to the horn and the halo effect. I'll deal with those together. Has anyone heard of the horn and halo effect? It's a piece that says basically if you meet me for the first time and I do something that you like, you will start to think of me as being quite good. And if I then start doing pieces of work, you'll generally think that that work is quite good. And even when I make mistakes, you'll excuse those because actually Rob's quite a good guy. Rob's quite good at this sort of stuff. That's just an aberration. If you met me for the first time and you decided you didn't like me very much, then the opposite would be true. That's the horns effect. I'm not going to be able to do anything right for you. If in my first meeting in the trustees, I'd made some complete egregious error, which, you know, maybe I did, there'll be trustees who then think, oh, why do we bring him on board? And they'll question everything I do subsequently. So those...
The issue really is that, if, say I'm in a meeting with a young lady and she says something, then how do I know when I reject it, it's not gender biased, or she's talking complete rubbish?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And either of those things could be true, couldn't it? You might be bringing all sorts of bias to the equation. On the other hand, what she's saying might be absolute rubbish. You don't know. It is right at the heart of questions around employment, for example, at the moment, where we are looking in all walks of life. You know, it is really positive that equality, diversity and inclusion forms such a central part of what we're trying to do in our society, to make our society fairer. But at the same time, we all know that there are situations where you're going for the right person for the role, where sometimes what will creep in instead is oh gosh, maybe we do need some more women on the board. Now, that's not an unfair thing to say, because actually maybe the company in question does need more women on the board. It doesn't offer a particular diversity of gender, of race, of sexual orientation, of age, and it needs to question that. But what you do going through your, and there's a lot of stuff that you can do during the recruitment process to anonymize data, to take bias out of it. But you get to the point then where you've got two candidates who both look really good. You can then choose to say, do you know what? Because of the need to increase diversity, I'm going to appoint this person. When you're talking about a one-to-one piece, it becomes really difficult. And this is what I'm saying about how important it is that you bring all of this back to yourself. You bring all of this back to really look. And in a moment, I'm going to come on, when I talk about managing behaviors, I'm going to talk about positive intent, really checking your intent. What are you trying to get out of it? What are you bringing to the party in terms of the pluses, but also the minuses? You know, is there something in the back of your mind that's always been a little bit anti the idea that women might be in X, you know, in this particular workplace, or that I have a friend, we share an awful lot of time watching rugby together. We both adore rugby, absolutely follow it. I love watching England's women's team because I think they play a standard of rugby that I wish the men could aspire to sometimes. And he won't, because he doesn't think it's a sport for women. Now that's, you know, that's his absolute bias. I mean, no one should force him to go to a women's rugby match if he doesn't want to go. But it's his absolute bias. He can't recognise that. I haven't been able to persuade him to recognise that that's his bias. He still rants that the world is wrong. He might be right. He might be right. And this is a key piece, isn't it? You know, differences of opinions exist, as I say, in every walk of life. And it doesn't mean to say that there is only one single version of the truth, and that is ours. Sorry, I keep thumping the microphone. I'm aware of that. Let me just give you a quick insight. So I've said a bit about myself. I've given a bit of an introduction to myself. If I said to all of you now that my education from 9 to 17 took place in an English public school, just pause a sec on what that simple statement has brought up in you. I can't believe that there's anyone in the room that is just utterly neutral about that. You've instantly formed some opinion of me. Might not be very much, might be quite extreme. You know, some people in the room might be going, oh yeah, me too. Some people in the room might be going, you posh twat. I absolutely understand all of those perspectives. If I were then to say to you that the reason I went to a public school was because my dad worked for the government and he was stationed overseas and there was no education, so the government paid for me to go to a boarding school, which pretty much by definition in England means a public school, that might alleviate it slightly. And if I then went on to say that both my father and my mother, born into working class stock before the Second World War, both had to leave formal education at 14. My father got a job as a telegram boy, and he worked his way up in the post office to mail delivery. And in 1939, he joined the army because he could see war was coming. And the army was his social mobility. He went from a private right up to major after being busted a couple of times at sergeant for drinking and fighting. But he ended the war as a major. And when he went back to the post office, they said, okay, well, we can't really put you back on your delivery round. Do you know what? We're going to make you manager of a telephone switchboard, which they did. And he proved really an adept manager. So they made him a regional network, and then they made him a management trainer. And then the Foreign Office came knocking on the door and said, we need people to teach management to countries that are about to get independence from the UK. Have you got anyone? They said, yeah, this guy, Bill Lloyd, send him overseas. And he went overseas. He told my mum he was going for 6 months. He was there for 27 years. And he toured around Africa and the South Pacific. And in that time, he couldn't give me a stable schooling, and the government stepped in to pay. So maybe that changes that perspective a little bit. Just that first piece, that initial reaction, clock what that statement said, and then think about how just a bit of exploration maybe leaves you feeling a bit different. Maybe not completely, you know. There is no denying that I've had opportunities in life because I got that education. Absolutely not. And maybe that's a foster for some resentment or some concern, whatever it may be. Those are all valid emotions, but just clock them. That's the process that's going on inside you that you need to be aware of when you're engaging with people. The upshot of all of this is one that I bet, let's see a show of hands of anyone who's ever felt excluded from a group. Yeah, pretty much, you know, good percentage of the room. An upshot of unconscious bias can often be, and particularly in clubs and societies, is an in-group and an out-group. The people that feel the ownership of the thing. They think themselves to be the absolute doers. And there's other people quite often then led on the edge. Now, that might not be your shed. Maybe your shed is completely inclusive. But it's always worth just checking that. Because back to that affinity bias, if we're only really looking at the people that are just like ourselves, what about some of those new joiners? What about some of those new joiners who come in who don't stay very long? Why is that? Why is it that they don't stay very long? Is there something we're doing, or is it something about them? But question it honestly. So, before we go into the questionnaire, which I'll pass around in a sec, I want to say a couple of things about it. The first thing is that our society and even our language have tons and tons of things that are about describing difference, that are about making us aware of difference, that are about highlighting difference, reacting to difference. And our society brings far less to the picture about what actually unites us. And of course, you know, in this room, we've got an absolute wonderful thing that unites us through men's sheds. You know, that is a piece of common ground. Whatever else is going on in our lives, whatever else separates us into different categories, we've got this huge area of commonality. And that's really important to hold on to as we come into the tactics. I'm going to see whether I can play you a short video clip that I really like. But I suspect I cannot. No, I'm sorry, I can't. Describing it won't do it huge justice, but I will try very briefly. We tried doing that before, and what it did was completely killed the PowerPoint. So I think rather than do a bit of further laptop faff, I'll describe this. The psychological experiment has been done in all sorts of ways for many years, but it really gained notoriety, and you can find it on YouTube, and I will include the link when I put the slide pack up on the UK MSA website. But it was a Danish TV company that basically got a bunch of people into the room, and the room was painted with little boxes, and people of similar sorts of backgrounds were clumped together. They had a group of nurses, they had a group of teachers, they had a group of bikers, they had what they called people who are new to Denmark, so refugee families, and they had people who had been in Denmark for more than 10 generations. So real sort of strong Scandinavian heritage. All sorts of other sets like that. And you could see these people eyeing each other up. Particularly everyone looking with great suspicion at the bikers. And then they asked a question: could everyone who's a step parent step to the far wall? Could everyone who's ever been bullied at school step to the far wall? Could everyone who's ever been a bully at school step to the far wall? Who likes beer? Who had sex last week? They ask all these questions, and of course, the groups that come together are made up of all these different categories of folk. And at the end, they ask the question, who loves Denmark? And of course, you know, everyone's against the back wall. I can't quite do it justice. It's well worth looking up. It's a really powerful video, I think, of showing how actually what binds us, what makes us human in the broadest sense, but what also makes us shedders, is so much more and so much more powerful than the differences we might feel. So I'm going to come on to the questionnaire now. I'm going to start with this. Let me say about personality questionnaires that I thank you. That would be excellent. Thank you very much. I had to use one of my jobs in my career was you should have had pens in your pack, but if not, I have more pens up here. Thank you. So one of my final jobs in government service was as the Chief Operating Officer for a merged corporate services centre for a number of government agencies. And that included the HR component. And as part of that, I was expected to do personality questionnaires, or at least oversee the process. I am not the world's biggest fan of them. I think they are a tool. I think they're a great utility. But I think they are that particular specialist plane or that particular specialist hammer that you have hanging up that you use for, I don't have any more, I'm afraid, that you have for one job and one job only, and it comes off the shelf just for that job. These are a tool. What I'd like you to do is look at the first page. The second page is a glossary of terms just to help. And across each row, you've got 4 words. Put an X next to the one that most describes you, best describes you. Please don't take time to think about it. Just do it and do it instinctively, because those are the best results. Whack through it. It should take no more than a minute or 2 to complete. So for those of you who are moving on to sheet 2 that I've just handed round, you'll see it's exactly the same words arranged across, and translate your ticks for the word you chose on the first piece of paper. Translate your ticks onto that second piece of paper, or your crosses, so that at the end of it you can add up a score for each column in each of the 4 colours that are shown at the bottom of the column. So the scores that you've come up with for those colour boxes, most of you will have one colour which is slightly higher scoring or maybe massively higher scoring than any of the others. So has anyone got an absolute clear-cut colour that they've come out with? And what colour? Blue, okay. Anyone else got one single colour? Yeah, okay. Green? Okay, so, you know, a bit of difference already. And some of you will bracket a number of them, but you'll probably have one which is predominant. A few of you will have almost equal numbers across 2, 3 or 4, but that's less usual. Those colours mean something. Huge EU mountain of salt over here, and I'm taking a massive great dollop of it and saying, the colours mean something in terms of who you are. Stress again, it's this point, it's a tool, it's a utility. We'll go through, I'm putting these on the website, so I'm not going to spend a long time on them. Did anyone get yellow as a predominant colour? Okay, so a couple of yellows in there. So you can see on the screen, you know, generally an open and indirect approach. Pace relaxed and slow. There's stuff about occupations, what the dislikes are, what the likes are. All right, and they come down what's the motivation, and this final phrase of a motto, a kind of, you know, summation of what the colour stands for. Like I say, I'm going to put these on the website. You'll have a chance to look through them. Unfortunately, I don't have them as handouts. The blues, it's slightly different. Relationship and interactions, all about what the blues are all about. They hate stuff that's boring. They hate technical, logical stuff. They hate rules. Generally speaking, that's what we see. Are we chiming? A little bit. Okay. Hey, let me tell you a joke, and then afterwards I'm going to tell you another one. I'm fairly sort of into this. That's my blue approach. The greens. We had quite a few greens, I think, over here. So fairly self-contained, more indirect. Tasks and facts. Yeah. So Charlie was telling me a story about a charity that he worked for previously, where he just couldn't get on with somebody who was the accountant, and actually, he finally clicked one day, because Charlie's a big fan of this setup, that the accountant was a green, and it just completely sort of opposite to Charlie, and that if he recognised what the person was he was dealing with and what he brought and how those differences might play in an interaction, there was the real value in something like this, because he could start to make some leeway for the other person's behaviour. The stuff that was really annoying him, but actually is very much in the green piece about wanting to nail down some of that detail, being less interested in the more wandering discussions, wanting to bring stuff back to empirical data. And then the red. So self-contained, very direct, tasks and facts again. Tendency towards being autocratic, my way or the highway, shut up or ship out. If you're in a leadership position and reds gravitate towards leadership positions, it's something to be really aware of. I don't think there's anything wrong with a directive style of leadership when directive styles of leadership are called for. To my money, the good leader will have a range of styles at their disposal, including collaborative, and in a voluntary organisation, a volunteer organisation, an organisation which is primarily about people getting together and combating some of the stuff that men's health, that men's sheds really specialise in looking at around men's health, men's well-being, then that sort of directive leadership might grate, and it's something to be aware of. If you come out with a predominant red, it's worth thinking about how you might just change your style in a different context. Absolutely, if you're sitting in a police operations room in the middle of a big counter-terrorist operation, you want reds all around you, because somebody's got to say, go here, do that, do this. Those sorts of directive pieces, unless you're up against a timeline with a project that isn't finished, aren't really great things to have in the wider world. They're certainly not great things to have in most of our personal relationships.
How do I tell my wife that?
Now, so what? What would she say if she were in the room here?
Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah. Well, I'll come on to a bit of that, because actually, I say it now. For me, I've said already, differences everywhere. We all know that. Differences all around us. The absolute central point of that for me is 9 times out of 10, differences caused by communication breakdown, something we don't understand, something we haven't taken enough time to explore, the fact that we're just letting those unconscious biases bubble through, and we're not asking the additional questions. We're not communicating. So let me move that on. What I would say then about actual strategies for managing difference, and some people boil this down to 2 things. They just talk about trust and rapport. That you build trust with the people that you're collaborating with, the people that you're working with, the people you're in relationships with. And you do that sometimes in fairly subconscious ways, but you can also do it in very conscious ways of showing some of your vulnerabilities, bringing people into the tent, as the saying goes. And they talk about the other side of that being rapport. What are the structures we put in place that enable us to work with other people? I think that's really important. I think trust and rapport actually to run through this, but for me it was a little bit simplistic. And I think what we have here is something that is more powerful in terms of really thinking about the difference that we're trying to combat or that we may not have even experienced yet, and how we strategize to be the best place we can in order to manage it. Understanding yourself and understanding their position, so utterly important. You know, the whole reason we spent the first part of this talking about ourselves, understanding ourselves and our biases is precisely that. Looking beyond your own triggers, the same sort of point. There's stuff about conflict that can be really triggering for us, and difference can lead to conflict. Somebody challenging us with a different point of view can actually be quite triggering, because maybe what it does is call into question our own self-belief. Maybe that different perspective makes us feel a little bit vulnerable. You know, if we're a red and someone's questioning us, we might feel we're losing a bit of control. So understanding those triggers and being able to say, I get what's going on, I'm just going to park that and come back to moving things forward. Same way taking responsibility for your own feelings. You have to take feelings out of it. I'll come on talk about sort of de-escalation and other tactics when you're in a real conflict situation. But you've got to take personal feelings out of it, because what personal feelings will do is lead you down to the opposite of point 7 when I come on to it. Similarity, not difference. We've talked a bit about that already. Really important. We go for that. Let's step back. Let's remember why we're all here. If there's a disagreement in your shed, step back. What do we all come together for? What are we actually discussing here? What are we actually arguing about? Being a great listener. Yeah, you said about you and your wife. A key issue in longer term relationships is often we stop really listening to each other. And by really listening, I mean actually hearing what the other person is saying. There's 2 great ways that you can do that. The first is to practice passive listening. Passive listening is where you do nothing but hear the other person. You don't interject with your own comments. You don't fiddle around with something else. You put the newspaper down. You just sit and you focus on the other person and what they're saying and do nothing else. It's absolutely critical in active listening that you give a bit of feedback. And I don't mean exactly as Professor Spiegelhalter said, you don't do that very male thing of coming back with a, yeah, and you know what? It happened to me, but it was even worse, because that's not active listening. That's just waiting to get your point across. Active listening is when you reflect back to the other person to show you've understood. You know, you and I are having real disagreement about something. I've tried to understand your point of view. I've tried to listen, and part of my active listening is to come back to you and say, okay, I think what you're telling me is ... and this is what you believe ... Part of active listening that you'll often see, if any of you have come across the term before or read sort of stuff in magazines or whatever about active listening, it's about nodding and smiling and engaging with the other person. Don't try to do that, because the minute you try to do that, you're not actively listening. You're focusing on, oh, I need to nod here. I need to give them a smile. I need to show that I'm listening. And then you're not listening because you're focused on something else. So really important to just let that happen naturally, organically. It's better, far better about reflection. Make a commitment, I think, is another really important tactic here. So if we're having a disagreement, and you know, whether this is in the home, and actually, you know, maybe it's even more important in personal relationships, but actually with our friends, with a group of people in a shed, even with strangers where we're trying to collaborate on something, losing sight of the big picture is a huge issue. It becomes massively them and us. It becomes an issue of complete divide. If I say, do you know what, John, actually, I know we're disagreeing on this issue, but I'm really committed to finding a solution. I really want to find that solution. So we're not seeing eye to eye right now, but I just want to say that here and now. And I'm committing to that. Now, can we find the space to talk about the stuff where we don't see eye to eye? Consider your positive intent. We talked about this right early on. What's actually your motivation here? You know, if you go into this saying, that person's really been pissing off all the other shedders, I'm going to go and tell them that their activity in the shed is really annoying everybody and they're bloody irritating. That's not actually a really helpful approach. If you can say to yourself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give that person some feedback in order that they can help improve how they interact for their benefit as well as everyone else's. That's a positive intent. Lunch is coming, so let me just, if you do find you get into a challenging behaviour, there's an acronym there. Again, it'll all be up on the website. I think these are all fairly self-explanatory. Don't lose your temper, don't escalate. Acknowledge the feelings that are in the room. Problem solve, think reflectively. And finally, the piece I wanted to talk about was just in terms of some of the central messages that we put out as people came out of lockdown and like more common in society, just started to find issues of tension. And recognizing in here the importance of self-care. I think this is really important. I wish that some of the health and wellbeing group had stayed on for this, because I think it's really important. Recognizing that disagreements can be really, really stressful for ourselves. Recognizing that we might become anxious about it and recognizing what those signs are and recognizing that that's perfectly normal. Let's just look after ourselves a bit. If it's more stress than it's worth, step away from it. It's just a really important point. And I think just coming back to our charter for wellbeing in health and wellbeing in craft and DIY, and remembering the tenets of that about looking out for each other, also looking out for ourselves. We're clearly out of time. Thank you very, very much. If there are questions, I'm really happy to take them. I'm happy to take them over lunch. I'm happy to take them now for those who want to stay behind. Good. Thank you.